The towns in this sequence declined for very different reasons. Kaskaskia was slowly consumed by the Mississippi River itself. Old Shawneetown relocated after catastrophic flooding. Cairo collapsed under the combined pressure of racism, deindustrialization, and economic abandonment. Meanwhile, places like Ruma, Nebo, McClure, and Emington are shrinking in a quieter way. No dramatic disaster, no national headlines, just fewer jobs, aging populations, school closures, and younger residents leaving year after year. Then there are places like East St. Louis and Harvey, where decline happened on an urban scale through industrial collapse, fiscal instability, and the long erosion of public systems that once held entire communities together. We begin with Kaskaskia, once Illinois' first capital, now a place the Mississippi River practically erased. Kaskaskia is not simply a small town that declined. It is a town reshaped and largely removed by geography. Once the first capital of Illinois, Kaskaskia did not unravel because of crime or economic failure, but because the Mississippi River changed course. In the 19th century, repeated major floods cut the town off from the Illinois mainland and steadily eroded away most of its land. Over time, the physical footprint shrank to the point where residents could no longer sustain normal town life, and the community largely surrendered to the river's constant pressure. Today, Kaskaskia is home to only a handful of people. There is no functioning downtown, no school, and very little infrastructure. Local income figures are difficult to interpret at this scale, so the broader Randolph County median, roughly $55,000, becomes the closest available reference, even though it does not meaningfully describe a community this small. Despite that, Kaskaskia remains officially recognized as a village, with a local leader in place, Michael Solser, serving as village president. From a capital lost to shifting water, we move to St. Omer, where flooding didn't destroy the town once but wore it down over time. After the clearer, documented transformation of Kaskaskia, St. Omer represents a quieter disappearance. This small riverside community once supported farming families and the basic institutions of local life: a school, small shops, and a routine that depended on stable ground and predictable seasons. But repeated flooding in the 19th and early 20th centuries eroded that stability. Homes were damaged, fields were drowned, and the practical costs of rebuilding accumulated year after year. The town did not end with a single decisive event. It drained out gradually. Families left one by one, leaving behind empty houses, quiet roads, and remnants slowly reclaimed by vegetation. What remains has become a destination mainly for photographers and historical explorers, drawn to the visible traces of a river town that continues to fade. There is no meaningful economy and no daily town activity to measure, only physical remnants that keep disappearing. After that slow disappearance, Old Shawneetown shows the blunt version: one catastrophic flood, then a decision to leave. Old Shawneetown was once a major trading center on the Ohio River, with merchants, courthouses, and the infrastructure of regional commerce. Its vulnerability was always tied to the river's power, and the catastrophic flood of 1937 became the turning point. The damage was severe enough that rebuilding on the same site was no longer treated as viable. Rather than restoring the original town in place, authorities chose to relocate residents to a new settlement on higher ground. That decision left the original site behind. What remains today is an area that is largely empty: cracked streets, abandoned buildings, and the outline of a town that no longer functions. With no permanent residential life, economic measures and crime statistics become essentially irrelevant. The defining feature is the absence of an active community. From a town relocated on purpose, we return to the riverbank with Joppa, where people held on until the water finally won. Joppa reflects a different form of river-driven decline. It began as a small but active river community shaped by trade, boat traffic, and surrounding farmland. But its low-lying location made it vulnerable to repeated Ohio River flooding, and over time that vulnerability became the town's defining limit. The decline here was gradual and practical. Homes were abandoned as repairs became untenable, schools closed, local shops disappeared as the population thinned. What remains are quiet streets and scattered structures that mark where daily life once occurred. Notably, Joppa is described as a place where a few residents held on into the late 20th century, placing it in the category of a semi-ghost town for much of its final phase, nearly extinguished but not fully empty until very late in its decline. Next is Hillview, still alive on paper but so small and fragile it feels like it is balancing on the edge. Hillview is not a fully abandoned ghost town. It is a tiny village in Greene County that remains inhabited, but its population has reached a critically low level and continues to shrink. Recent census data places Hillview at roughly 94 residents, down from nearly 200 in 2010. That scale makes the community structurally vulnerable. Even small shifts, outmigration, school changes, aging households, can have an outsized impact on whether the town can continue to function as a place with shared services and daily stability. One of the most defining events in Hillview's modern history occurred during the Great Flood of 1993, when a levee failure left the village almost completely submerged. Some parts were covered by as much as 20 feet of water, a disaster that caused lasting damage and reinforced the sense of fragility. In a town this small, a shock of that magnitude does not simply pass. It accelerates departure, weakens confidence, and makes it harder for younger families to justify staying. Hillview remains present, but the margin between community and disappearance is thin. From a tiny village fading, we arrive in Cairo, where the collapse was not only water but everything that followed it. Cairo sits at the meeting point of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, a location that once made it strategically important. At its height, it functioned as a major trade and transportation center, supported by a port and rail connections that tied it to regional commerce. But Cairo's decline is described here as more than a flood story. It is framed as a convergence of forces: racism, deindustrialization, and economic collapse that drained the city's social and economic life over time. As the 20th century reshaped the region, areas that once thrived lost activity. Homes were abandoned, schools and businesses shut down, public services weakened under shrinking resources. The population fall captures the scale of that decline, from more than 15,000 in the 1950s to around 2,500 today. Cairo is often described as a living ghost town, not because it is empty, but because the physical city remains while much of its functional life has thinned out. After Cairo's heavier story, Mound City is quieter, another river town where stagnation did the damage. Mound City is presented as a smaller and more straightforward case. It once depended on its role as a military base and river port, with local trade tied to boat traffic and the movement of goods. As the port lost relevance, the town's economic purpose narrowed. Schools and businesses closed in stages, and younger residents left in search of work elsewhere. What follows in places like this is not a single collapse, but a steady reduction in the daily systems that make a town feel active. The current picture is described as quiet main streets, abandoned houses, and a community so small that crime data becomes minimal, largely because there is less activity to measure. The economic strain shows in the reported median household income of roughly $33,000, well below national norms, reinforcing why outmigration continues. Mound City still exists, but the social scale has contracted to the point where stagnation becomes the defining condition. Leaving the river corridor, we head inland to Mount Olive, where coal once meant stability, and its decline means pressure. Mount Olive is framed differently from the river towns. Its vulnerability is tied less to flooding and more to the weakening of the single industry that once supported it. As a coal town, Mount Olive relied on mining for steady employment and local economic stability. With mines closed or scaled back significantly, the town has been left with fewer job paths and less certainty about long-term prospects. Historic mining-era buildings remain, serving as visible reminders of what the town was built around. The population has declined gradually over decades, and the reported median household income sits at roughly $40,000, below the Illinois average. That combination, shrinking employment base, slow outmigration, and limited replacement industry, creates pressure that does not always look dramatic, but steadily narrows the town's ability to retain younger residents and maintain full civic life. From coal country, we step into McClure, an agricultural place that feels like it is slowly running out of reasons to stay. After Mount Olive, the focus shifts to McClure, a small settlement in rural Illinois that is still inhabited but increasingly fragile. It is described as a town on the edge of becoming a ghost town. The population continues to shrink, more homes sit empty, and the town's long-term direction feels uncertain. McClure does not have the defining driver of a river port or a mining industry. It is a small agricultural community with limited economic opportunity beyond local farming and basic services. With only dozens to a few hundred residents, the social base is narrow, and that makes the town sensitive to ongoing outmigration. Younger families often leave for larger cities where work is more stable, and the remaining population skews older. Median household income is described as roughly $38,000, reflecting an economy that remains constrained and a community struggling to create new paths forward. Next is Emington, peaceful farmland on the surface and a slow leak of people underneath. Emington presents as quiet and orderly from the outside, but it carries the familiar pattern of rural decline. It has no major industry, no railroad-based economic engine, and no river trade to anchor commerce. Daily life depends largely on agriculture and a small set of local businesses, which limits the town's ability to grow or attract new residents. Historically, Emington served as a gathering point for surrounding farm families, supported by an active school and church-centered community life. Today, the town's high school has already closed, and local shops rely heavily on customers from outside the village rather than sustained local demand. Median household income is estimated around $42,000, signaling limited economic growth. Emington remains at risk of being left behind in the cycle of aging population, narrow job prospects, and minimal new investment. From Emington, we drift to Ruma, another small town where the future keeps moving away faster than it returns. A few miles south, Ruma is described as another small agricultural town facing continued population decline. It follows a familiar trajectory. Outward migration weakens the local base, which then reduces services and makes the town less able to hold residents over time. Ruma once functioned as a stable rural community surrounded by corn and soybean fields, supported by a local school and a handful of small shops. As younger generations left for education and work elsewhere, houses emptied and the town's daily activity thinned out. Even in its reduced state, the town still has landmarks such as a historic church and an old town hall, reminders of when community life had more scale and consistency. Median household income is estimated around $41,000, consistent with an economy that remains too limited to draw significant new settlement. Then we reach Nebo, quiet roads, a shrinking community, and just enough life left to feel the tension. Nebo is presented as a small agricultural community that appears calm, but is steadily pressured by demographic decline. The local economy depends almost entirely on farming, with few businesses or additional industries to broaden employment. That narrow base leaves the town exposed to the same dynamics seen across many rural villages. As young families leave, more homes sit empty, and the remaining community becomes smaller and older. Even so, Nebo still maintains active social anchors. Historic churches and community halls continue to function as gathering points for those who remain, preserving a thin but persistent civic life. Median household income is estimated at around $39,000, reflecting the limited and fragile economic conditions that shape the town's slow, ongoing contraction. After rural decline, we hit East St. Louis, where the ghost town story turns urban, massive, and brutal. After moving through villages that are thinning out slowly, East St. Louis presents a different scale of decline. Located just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri, it is framed here as a case of extreme deindustrialization. Factories and transportation-linked activity that once anchored the city's economy shut down or moved away, and the loss of that base triggered a long population exodus from entire districts. The result is described as an urban form of ghost town conditions: abandoned houses, closed schools, and reduced public services in neighborhoods that no longer function at the density they were built for. The population has fallen from more than 82,000 in the 1950s to around 17,000 today, one of the sharpest collapses cited in the United States. Median household income is placed near $25,000, alongside very high poverty levels, underscoring how economic vulnerability and physical abandonment reinforce each other. In this framing, East St. Louis is not empty, but it has lost the core systems that once made it a thriving city. From that scale of collapse, Pearl feels almost delicate, small, historic, and quietly thinning out. Only a few miles from Nebo, Pearl is described as a small farming town where decline shows up in a softer form. It once operated as a close-knit rural community, supported by farmland, a modest set of local shops, and an elementary school that functioned as a daily anchor for families. Over time, younger residents left for education and work in larger cities, and the town's scale narrowed as houses emptied and streets grew quieter. Pearl still holds visible markers of its older civic life. Several 19th century historic structures remain, including churches and community buildings that stand as physical evidence of a period when the town's population and activity were larger. Median household income is estimated at around $40,000, reflecting an economy that is limited in its ability to attract new residents or substantial investment. Pearl remains inhabited, but its trajectory is defined by gradual outflow rather than renewal. And to close, we end in Harvey, close to Chicago, yet unraveling in a way that feels shockingly isolated. Harvey is presented as a suburban city whose vulnerability is tied less to rural decline and more to fiscal instability and weakening public systems. It sits near Chicago, yet it has still lost residents as services weakened and economic opportunity narrowed. The town's crisis is described as severe enough that, at its height, nearly 40% of city staff were placed on unpaid leave, including police, firefighters, and administrative employees. That level of disruption signals structural fragility at the municipal level, not simply a temporary downturn. Median household income is described at roughly $38,000, lower than many surrounding suburbs, and that gap reinforces the outward pressure on residents who have the ability to move. Harvey remains a functioning place, but the combination of budget breakdown, strained infrastructure, and steady population loss places it in the category of communities at risk of continuing decline, even while sitting within the orbit of a major American metro area.